Welcome, everybody, to our first transatlantic webinar between the Future Power Market Forum and Future Power Market Platform. I'm Ben Hobbs, representing the U.S. Future Power Markets Forum.
And welcome. I'm Karsten Neuhoff, representing the Future Power Markets Platform and the European partners.
Great. Karsten, you're from the Technical University of Berlin and the German Institute of Economic Research, which has been the lead organizer, but with much help for the platform these past 7 years.
And Ben with Johns Hopkins University and the California IESO Surveillance Committee. Now we've timed this event to follow the publication of the bidding zone review. And despite the clear mandate to give guidance, it seemed to be impossible for the TSOs to make a recommendation on the future shape of the bidding zones. Their models showed that large zones cannot address the structural constraints. And when moved to smaller zones, there were concerns about liquidity and market power under the zonal pricing model. Perhaps a good moment to also explore alternative market design options.
So in the States, we faced similar challenges to manage grid congestion. And we initially experimented with various market design options to address these, including zonal pricing. But ultimately, locational marginal pricing offered a response that did allow for effective congestion management while maximizing liquidity and competition in short-term and day-ahead markets.
This is not a surprise for academics. We've widely argued for locational marginal pricing as an efficient power market design. And we're successful insofar that there is a large agreement that location pricing is theoretically a good solution. But while the economists consider theoretically a complement, for market design and policy choices, a theoretical good solution is a code for practical not feasible.
Now, this was always puzzling to us in the U.S. Why might our market design, which we now have almost a couple decades of experience with the various markets, be considered infeasible in practice? I don't mean to imply that it's been easy or cheap, far from that. But and I don't mean to imply that there are no more problems to be solved. Anyway, I'm very much looking forward to find out from today's discussion if there are uniquely EU obstacles and whether U.S. experience can help overcome them.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to the first-hand stories of our U.S. colleagues. They were directly involved and responsible for the practical implementation of locational marginal pricing in different regions of the U.S.
So let's get on with it. So I'd like to start with the first of our 4 speakers and introduce Mark Rothleder, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the California Independent System Operator, who I've had the great pleasure of working with for over 20 years in my role as a market advisor. You'll find detailed bios of Mark and the other speakers in materials that are emailed to you. So Mark was a member of the original startup team in 1997, and he's now I did not know this, the longest serving IESO employee. And his vision and patient collaboration with stakeholders smoothed the IESO's transition to locational marginal pricing on April 1st, April Fool's Day 2009. And more than anyone else, he has been responsible for its success. So, Mark, the mic's yours.
Thanks, Ben. I like to consider myself a survivor. So thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity for discussing congestion management and our experience in the California IESO. I think I have a fairly unique vantage point seeing the evolution of congestion management and the market design. So with that, I think I only have 8 to 10 minutes, and I'm just going to quickly just give you a little bit of background about the CAISO, and then I'll be quickly jumping to slide 5, but let's go next slide for now. So just to orient you, we are one of 9 IESO RTOs in North America. We're the only IESO in the Western Interconnection in the US. There is the Alberta Electric System Operator in Canada, which is also in the Western Interconnection. But the rest of the West is generally doing bilateral activity, not centralized market, with the exception of our expansion, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which I'll discuss shortly. Just a matter of size, we are a 52,000 megawatt peaking system, and you can see the rest of these stats. So next slide, please. Oh, just to point out, we are well in the transition to clean renewable resources. In the previous slide, you can see the resource mix, and you can also observe we've got a large amount of storage resources, almost 13,000 megawatts of storage for our batteries that are in the system now. As a balancing area in the California system, we have certain responsibilities to obviously balance supply and demand, ensure the transmission is securely operated, meaning no overloads, be prepared for contingency events by maintaining certain operating reserves. But we also, in our role, we operate the wholesale electric market, and that means the day-ahead market, the real-time market in the balancing area footprint. But we also operate what is called the Western Energy Imbalance Market, covering now 80% of the West. We also provide a higher level reliability coordinator role to ensure reliability across the Western Interconnection. And then also we are preparing to expand our day-ahead market offering and extend it to those who are voluntarily want to participate, for those who are in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just a slide, just kind of give you some orientation on the Western Energy Imbalance Market. This started, we took our real-time market, which is a locational marginal price, security constrained economic dispatch, and unit commitment that operates on a 5 and 15-minute basis. We took that and we were asked whether we could offer that service voluntarily to other parts of the West. And we did that starting in 2009, and it has steadily grown and provided increased value to those customers who are in those balancing areas that are participating in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. It's important to note that the Western Energy Imbalance Market allows balancing areas continued autonomy and responsibility for reliability, but it is an efficient way to move energy around the system on a 5 and 15-minute basis where and when it's needed, subject to transmission constraints, and producing both dispatch and prices, consistent dispatch and prices to dispatch resources across a wider footprint. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to stay on this slide for about 5 minutes or so, and this will just allow me to discuss the history and the evolution of congestion management in the California ISO. So in 1998, when we started to launch the wholesale market under the CAISO, what the design at that point, and this was basically combining up 3 balancing areas, the 3 major balancing areas in California were Southern Cal Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And as a result of deregulation, they got together with many stakeholders to design the market. And there was choices to be made at that time. And one of the choices that was made was maintaining a simple, commercially supportive zonal pricing mechanism. And that was at the time believed to be the best approach. It was grounded on some of the some assumptions that we know where the major congestion is, and it's not going to significantly change with the market dispatch. And as a result of that, they basically set up 2 major zones. with a major constraint through the middle of the system being the dividing line, and it basically separated the system into two zones. It also somewhat ignored the fact that the California system was part of the rest of the West and interconnected and in parallel with other transmission systems in the wider interconnection. So it kind of created this simplified commercial model with two zones. We started the market and it was able to operate, but quickly after starting the market in 2000, we did identify that, well, there's more congestion in the system than we had anticipated. And within a year or so, we expanded from 2 zones to 3 zones. And we were experiencing at that time, between 1998 and beyond 2000, we started to experience where there was even more congestion than we had anticipated. And what we identified was that the zonal market was not providing really good signals for that intrazonal congestion that we called it at the time. And that was it became pretty obvious at that point that having a zonal price when you had intrazonal congestion was actually sending strategically wrong signals. In other words, people could strategically schedule and get paid uplift payments to move knowing that there was intrazonal congestion. And although it was not the cause of the crisis in 2000 and ultimately 2001, it was a contributing factor, and it was identified by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as a flaw, a design flaw. And as a result of that, it was after the crisis in 2000, I won't get into the details of the other contributing causes of the crisis, but it was as a result of the crisis in 2000, it was identified that we should move on and modify that to be more dynamic, and we ultimately chose to move it to nodal pricing. So between 2000 and 2009, there was significant amount of effort to redesign not just the congestion management features of the market, but other features as well of the market. And an effort was underway. We called it initially MDO2 with the expectation that we would be done by 2002. And then we quickly realized it was going to take longer and there was more things that needed to be modified. So between 2001 and 2009, we designed and implemented and ultimately implemented the new market redesign technical upgrade in 2009. Along the way, while we didn't move to locational marginal pricing until 2009, we did bring in certain features that were supportive of the move, including implementing some automated market power mitigation design, pre-running or pre-viewing some real-time economic dispatch enhancements, and introducing at the time what was resource adequacy requirements, which was ensured that we had sufficient resources available for meeting the load, but also in the localized areas where congestion could occur. So long story short, 2009, we implemented successfully the locational marginal pricing, went from 2 zones to dynamically managing 1,000 nodes. And it doesn't mean that you have 1,000 spread out prices, but it does allow what I consider locational marginal pricing being a dynamic zonal mechanism. And you see features where not all constraints bind, but when those constraints bind, the prices naturally separate in certain regions, but it can be dynamically done based on the conditions of the system. So
can you conclude?
So yeah, let me stop here. Other than to say that 2009 LMP design was a great launching point for other things, including both supporting renewable clean energy transition, but also offering this locational marginal price mechanism and congestion management through our regional market expansion. So I'll stop there and be prepared to answer questions along the way. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And we're really looking forward to challenging you on all of the experiences in the breakout group. Next on our speakers list is Susanne Poppe. She's on the governing body of the Western Electricity Market until 2022, was managing director of FTI Consulting out of Boston, and was deeply involved in pretty much all the ISOs, independent New York ISO, ISO in New England implementation, NYISO implementation, CAISO, and recently in Ontario, the independent system operator moved to locational pricing. And I think without further ado, that's what we're looking forward to hear from you now, the experience there.
Thank you for that introduction, Karsten, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about my experience in implementing LMP electricity markets. I've been asked to provide some observations about what was learned during the process of implementing LMP in the Canadian province of Ontario. So 7 minutes is quite a short time to talk. I'll be just hitting the most important points on the following slides and be very happy to follow up, answer questions, and elaborate on any other points you see on those slides that you'd like to discuss during the breakout sessions. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to just introduce Ontario with the map and a few introductory facts. This is just a picture to orient you. You can see the IESO, Independent Electricity System Operator, sitting up here above the Great Lakes in the United States, connected to the Midcontinent ISO and New York ISO. What you can see in this picture are the 10 zones that the IESO uses for settlements with its loads. The supply in the IESO is all settled nodally. Imports and exports are settled at prices at specific intertie points with other regions. For all of these cases, the time step for the settlements in real time is 5 minutes. So the LMP markets in Ontario just started on May 1st of this year. And so far, it's going remarkably well. Scott Harvey, who you hear from later, and I are talking with them on a weekly basis, and they're reporting that they're having remarkably fewer problems than they expected. And I don't know all the reasons for that, but we'll speculate on a few of them. They had considered moving to LMP several times earlier, even before the year 2000, as I recollect, but encountered resistance to it that I recollect as being primarily political concerns about the effect on the prices being paid to supply up in the northern part of this region. Supply would have faced much lower value and much lower prices under LMP, and the higher prices that would have been encountered by loads in the southern part of the province in a move to LMP. This time around, starting in about 2016, there was commitment at a high level in moving to LMP for a number of reasons. Two of them were high constrained off payments being made to supply up in the north. These were just huge payments being made under their single price system for suppliers not to operate and not to supply under their settlement system. And also with a forward-looking perspective by the IESO that they needed a price signal that would help them to manage the growing supply from intermittent resources in their footprint. So they needed a price signal that varied both temporally as well as locationally. Next slide, please. So just to preview, the bottom line from my perspective is that the implementation of LMP in Ontario has gone very smoothly. They benefited greatly from the learning experiences in implementing LMP in other regions. They took great pains to learn from the experience in other regions as they developed their software, their management processes, their stakeholder processes. But they also benefited a lot from a number of contextual factors that reduce the risks and challenges of LMP implementation in Ontario. So I'm not going to talk through these here, other than to note that these existed for Ontario. I don't expect that these would be replicated elsewhere. The other thing that this slide illustrates is the great variety of risks and challenges that were in the right-hand column that were overcome in regions other than Ontario. LMP implementations that spanned multiple jurisdictions, whether these were balancing areas or multiple states, regions that had not previously operated a state estimator or operated as the balancing area. The only other thing I wanted to point out in this slide is something that will be repeated, I think, by other speakers, is a great advantage in Ontario was that they had prior experience operating security-constrained economic dispatch. In the LMP implementations in the states, they are all built up from security-constrained economic dispatch as an operational tool. And the pricing system of LMP is meant to provide prices that are consistent with eliciting bids and offers from a market context that will support reliable and least cost real-time dispatch. And all the bells and whistles that you hear about are built off of this SCD base. Next slide, please. So there are also some factors that and choices that were made that affected the risks and challenges of LMP implementation in Ontario. They chose to introduce multiple core LMP market elements at the same time. I think that was done in Ontario because it operates as a single balancing area. There was the political will to do it, but it's not necessary to do that. I want to emphasize in other regions. And in fact, I think there's been a lot of success in regions like the Western energy imbalance market that Mark just talked about, in the Midcontinent IESO, in regions that have implemented LMP by rolling it out regionally over successive balancing areas that are connected, or by rolling out successive bells and whistles to LMP off of a basic platform that was initially introduced. So you can delay introducing two settlements or co-optimization of reserves and energy or 5-minute settlements, so that you can roll this out both regionally and you can roll it out in terms of market elements. Another just thing that I want to emphasize here that helped with the success of the LMP implementations in Ontario was the real extensive time they devoted to stakeholder education and engagement. They had a real marching plan for that, and also the time they spent investigating and using the software from other regions as they implemented LMP. Next slide, please. Finally, the major issues that were addressed in the Ontario LMP design were, how the granularity of the settlements for loads and how to insulate loads from price impacts of introducing LMP, and how to address energy limited resources, cascade hydro, and some thermal resources with long lead times for startup that they needed for their operational reliability. And so software solutions were developed building on software that existed elsewhere to address some of these specific factors that are now becoming important in other regions like energy limited resources. So there is a 27-hour rolling unit commitment process that's now being used in Ontario that I think is really foreshadowing what may be coming in other regions. So I think I just want to wrap up now by just saying that, in summary, what Ontario did to make this relatively easy, I'm sure they wouldn't say it was easy, and relatively straightforward was the use of software and experience from other regions, extensive stakeholder involvement, and very targeted development of solutions that were needed to address region-specific issues. So I'd be happy to address additional questions either now or in the breakout sessions.
Okay. That was terrific, Susan. Thanks very much. We can address narrow technical questions, one or two right now. If any of you want to put that into the Q&A. If somebody wants to raise their hand and just be unmuted, we could do that right now. But just looking for narrow questions, we'll have broader questions for the entire panel later on. Okay, so thanks again, Susan. Now let's move from Ontario. We'll cross Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and go into the St. Lawrence River and go into New York. And representing New York, I'm very happy to have Rana Mukerji with us. So for nearly 20 years until last year, he was Senior VP of Market Structures for the New York Independent System Operator, where he laid the foundation for the next generation of electric markets in the Empire State. And they were one of the first ISOs to try out locational marginal pricing. After leaving the New York ISO, he founded Loudon Energy Analytics to provide analytical and advisory services to help companies succeed in today's fast-changing electricity market landscape. So, Rana, please step up to the virtual podium. It's yours.
Oh, thank you, Ben. And I just wanted to mention, even before I was in New York ISO in the mid-90s, I worked with Susan and Scott and Bill Hogan on conceptualizing a lot of these ISO designs. And I remember at one point, San Diego Gas Electric wanted nodal markets in California, but they were overruled. And Mark talked about the trajectory. Just so next slide, Leon. Talking about New York. New York is a smallish ISO. 33 gigawatts was the all-time peak. I believe yesterday we hit 31 because it was a hot spell. New York ISO, one of the unique features is that it's connected. If you look at the orange, brownish on the Northeast USA, is surrounded by green, which is ISO New England, the purple PJM, blue MISO, Ontario, and it's also connected with Hydro-Quebec. So New York is connected with both ISOs and non-ISOs, and interchange power with all entities around it. New York is also a constrained area. There's constraints into New York and constraints within New York. New York is 2/3 of the load is in New York, around New York City, Long Island, Westchester, and the Western New York is 1/3 of the load, probably 1/3 of the people, 2/3 of the people, and the demand is in New York City. And New York City is like a huge sink of electrons. Every electrons in the East Coast want to come to New York City. And that is one of the reasons why historically there has been less transmission built into New York, because other regions did not want to build power plants and have that sucked into New York City, and their prices would actually go up. So even in Western New York is also almost like New York is a state as well as a city. So there is also downstate and upstate, and they all act like two different states electrically, because nobody wants to connect to downstate because of New York City being the sink of electrons. Of course, that is all changing as we go into a very aggressive renewable energy target. So there's a lot of transmission being considered into New York. One other aside is that New York, New England, and PJM started as power pools. They started as power pools after the blackout of 1965 to form control areas and do joint unit commitment. So New York was a control area. There were 7 utilities in New York. Before that, every utility did its own unit commitment. When New York became a power pool, it did a control area-wide unit commitment and shared the benefits. So New York, New England, and PJM actually had experience in shared operation before the formation of the ISO, which was in 1999. Next slide. I think this is the most important point I want to make. We listened to what Bill Hogan, Susan, and Scott told us in the mid-90s, and we implemented a big bang implementation of the ISO. When the ISO, and it was not done hastily. It was done with about 5 years of run-up of software and testing before it was done. So the 1999 New York ISO implemented both day-ahead and real-time markets. It implemented capacity market, demand response programs, ancillary services, virtual trading, congestion hedges all at once. And it was a mammoth software implementation, but we were very blessed that we actually implemented everything all at once, because one of my key takeaways of watching other ISOs is that once you implement a so-called simplistic, not simplistic, something which is tractable, seem to be reasonable, and money changes hands. And you know, in electricity markets, billions of dollars change hands. So once you have money changing hands, it's very, very difficult to make incremental changes. And in Ontario's case, Susan pointed out, it took from 2002 to 2025, 23 years to go from a in-day real-time market to a day-ahead market. It is mind-boggling of how long it took. California, as Mark said, started with 2 zones, went to 3 zones, and then from 2001, after the market meltdown, which it took 8 years. New England started with one zone in prices. Then they realized all the power plants were locating in Maine and Western Massachusetts, where there was no congestion. All the load centers was in Boston and Connecticut. They had to build several $1 billion of transmission, and then they went to Nodal. So one of the great things about implementing a nodal pricing and give the right signals is that you get the prices which are consistent with what the operators need at any given time in real time. So when you have pricing which is consistent with system needs and operator needs, you actually do not have to invent a whole different so-called ancillary services to do things which the system operators need. So a well-designed, well-implemented nodal market actually makes prices consistent with system needs. So that is one of the strengths of it. New York did one major change. The Big Bang implementation in 1999 there was a transmission network between the real-time market and the day-ahead market were different. Because the real-time market runs every 15 minutes, they had a simpler transmission representation because it had to run very often. So that was causing uplift between what the resources were paid to do and what they had to do in real time. So that was one major change, which was called SMD2, the Standard Market Design 2, which made the real-time transmission representation consistent with the day ahead. And that took several years and took a lot of stakeholder engagement. So my input is the systems are complex. If you make nodal pricing, one of the biggest benefits of that is pricing is consistent with what the system needs are. And second is that once you have billions of dollars changing hands based on a so-called simplistic market design, it takes years. In Ontario's cases, more than 2 decades to make the change. Throughout my career at ISO, from 2006 to 2024, I was waiting for Ontario to implement it. They were going to do it in the next couple of years, and it took 20 years for them to find. I'm glad they actually did it. So that would be my point. One other point I wanted to make is that when the Big Bang change was done in 1999, it was a very ambitious software implementation, but there were safeguards taken so that we don't black out the system. Basically, what was done was the market systems nothing changed in terms of operator action. The market prices were consistent with what the operators needed, but as basically a safeguard, there was ability to suspend the market operations and just go back to just operator controls. And as a second tier was that even the New York ISO could fall back on the transmission owners to run this transmission owners, which were the utilities, to run the system in case there was any hiccup in the market systems. So essentially, the first precaution was taken was the market system could be suspended. The second one was the whole system operator could delegate control back to the utilities to do it in case there was. there was not a issue such as that. The only time New York suspended market operation was in the blackout of 2003, where the whole Eastern Interconnect went down. So one of the biggest, and if you go to the next slide, what we would see is that some of the benefits of giving nodal pricing, the first benefit we saw was the locational signals. The locational signals caused a lot of retirement and addition. So about 12 gigawatts of power plants retired, and they were replaced with newer and more efficient power plants, which were better, which had more environmental benefits. So you will see that over the 1999 to 2023, the SOx and NOx emissions went down by 99% or 90% plus, both of them. CO2 was in a downward trajectory as well because of more efficient plants. Even gas turbines, combined cycles, which were mostly built, had better CO2 performance than the older units they replaced. There was uptick with the retirement of a 2,000 megawatt nuclear plant, which has to be replaced by wind and solar. But just this week, there was announcement of a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant being considered in New York by New York Power Authority. So the challenge now is to actually, the other thing that happened was because of the price signals, New York City being the highest price region and the most attractive region, transmission was built into New York, namely in the form of high voltage DC cables. There was a cable first built from Connecticut into Long Island. There were 2 cables built from New Jersey into one to Long Island, another one to New York, a couple of them to New York City. So giving locational pricing incentivizes the right kind of retirements and additions. But for now, the target for New York is 70% renewable very soon, 2030. It's very, very ambitious. And the other one is 100% carbon free in 2050. So to do that, there has to be very, very large amounts of wind and solar to be added. New York is about 25% hydro, 20% nuclear. So all of the rest has to be done. And currently, there's only 5 to 6% of solar and wind. So wind and solar has to be ramped up very, very aggressively and backed up by battery storage. To do that, there has to be market changes. One of the things is that you have to procure reserves dynamically. Secondly, New York has a capacity market. You need to value capacity properly as well. There is a method of proper capacity accreditation, where 100 megawatt gas turbine is worth about 95 megawatts load carrying capability. 100 megawatts wind plant is not worth 95 megawatts in load carrying capability. So that has to be accounted for. The other one is when you have so much variable generation, which is intermittent, you need to carry adequate amount of reserves in the right region. But the basic LMP-based market, which was set up in 1999, provides the fundamental underpinning of this market where you build market enhancements from. So I will stop now, Karsten, and look forward to the more discussions.
Thanks so much, Rana. Really helpful, particularly also the sense in terms of how you had backup systems at the implementation that you didn't need, and probably sounds like you could sleep at that time. One question came from the audience. Did you have liquidity issues in the short-term markets at the time, and how did you deal with them if you did so?
There was not, there was no liquidity issue. There was an issue with the market gaming at one point on the reserves market, which had to be tackled. Basically, the market monitor had to call up the person and said, stop doing that, and they were referred to FERC. And there was essentially FERC proceedings, which lasted probably 10 years before all the settlements cleared up. So I would say when you run the markets, the gaming issue is very, very important to monitor. California found that out. All others. So when you run these markets, you have to monitor for market gaming because it changes with time and it changes with location. So you have to have very, very aggressive real time, especially in a congested market, but like New York City. So you have to monitor gaming.
Well, this is luckily not a problem in Europe because we have portfolio-based bidding, and so we can't see any of gaming, so we don't have gaming issues. That makes life easier for the monitors in Europe. not all participants necessarily, would be my guess. Thanks again, Rana, for you. And I hope we've managed to dig out of this black hole for electrons from New York City to go back to the Midwest, the heart of the US. Scott, let me introduce you. Really thankful for being here, a senior advisor with FTI Consulting, a member of the California ISO and Western Energy Imbalance Market Surveillance Committee, was deeply involved, as Rana just referred to already, in PGM, New York ISO, ISO New England, NYISO, California, and Western Energy Imbalance Market, and Ontario. And before this, 10 years of track record with the US Federal Trade Commission. So, Scott, what's your reflection on MISO, but perhaps you can put this in a broader context in terms of experiences that you can relate to. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Leon, Karsten, and Ben for the opportunity to talk here. And I decided rather than going in depth into MISO here in these slides, I'll talk about MISO in the breakout session, but I was going to try to make a couple of high-level remarks. Go to the next slide, Leon. And as Ben said, this slide responds to the observation, LMP is no longer a theoretical, abstract, difficult to implement mechanism. It's been in effect in 4 of these ISOs for 20 years. It's implemented in 8 North American ISOs, so it's well tested and no longer anything like a theoretical construct. The alternatives are theoretical constructs, in my view. Go to the next slide. Now, a few elements about core features, and Rana and Susan have already talked about this, and Mark, but one core feature is security-constrained economic dispatch, which means all the resources that are flexible can bid into the market and be dispatched by the ISO, taking account simultaneously energy and ancillary services and congestion management. You skipped to slide 4. You shouldn't be on slide 4. What happened to slide 3?
There doesn't seem to be a slide 3.
Okay.
Or is it somewhere in the back?
Yeah,
Sorry.
never mind. Yeah, okay. Something got screwed up in the slide, so we'll try to repost that. But one of the points is that security-constrained economic dispatch has been very important in driving LMP in some of these markets because a core element is we fully utilize the transmission system. The other element is that a characteristic of North American markets, LMP, is that the load pricing is generally zonal, in large part because we don't have any means of measuring real-time load except at the zonal level. That's what the systems measure. And picking up on what Rana talked about, market power mitigation is not only in LMP markets, it's in all the markets. And by now, all of the LMP markets have well-developed market power mitigation designs that are triggered when there's transmission congestion and are triggered when the area that's congested has limited supply options. But this has been worked out. We're continuing to refine it, but it is an existing design that, again, has been implemented for many years. Now, this is the slide 4. So we're on the right. Just a couple comments on implementation and choices. One is that using an existing market design rather than creating one from scratch avoids unintended consequences, so it simplifies things, and limiting the changes during the implementation phase to those that are necessary for LMP implementation simplifies things, especially when something is not working right. You don't have to go through 40 things that you changed. You just go to the core elements of the LMP market that you implemented, and you can figure out, okay, what's not working right. The more I can elaborate on that again more later. Another element to this is that new software functionality, new vendors can be good and have benefits, but they do raise implementation risks. Next slide. Now this is, as outlined on this slide, successful implementation in part depends on a lot of very simple things. Vendor software testing, market participant training, all this stuff can be done. And this is pretty standard by now, and I'm sure it's standard in Europe, but it's an important factor in reducing implementation risk. For the economists and engineers, I think it's important to observe that one characteristic of LMP pricing that simplifies testing and implementation is that all the prices obey first and second order conditions. So there are methods of testing and knowing whether the answer is right. You don't have to replicate the solution to know that it's solving correctly. Next slide. And this follows on what Rana said. Several of the markets that we talked about that switched to LMP were already operating centralized security constrained economic dispatch. So all they had to do was add a price calculation module. So that was pretty easy peasy from implementation. Down at the other end, at the bottom, you've got MISO and SPP, where they weren't a balancing area. They didn't have any regional coordination in terms, there was no security constrained economic dispatch. There was no dispatch period. They were starting from scratch. So they had the highest implementation risk, but they were successful. To go on, next slide. So some things that are important in terms of how long does it take? How do we do this? One factor in the U.S. is just reaching agreement can be difficult. In the U.S., that there was a lot of time in stakeholder discussions converting existing transmission rights and entitlements into FTRs. You don't have those existing entitlements, I think, in Europe, so it'll be simpler. Again, a key feature in timing is how much you're using existing software, existing market design, stuff that's off the shelf, or are you creating something on your own? And you got to listen to your vendors and when they say it's a research project or whether it's something that's off the shelf and can be done. Another key factor is project management. It's simple, perhaps, but you can't have people running the implementation that also have a day job in terms of running the market. So it's important to think that through and have people that are in charge of the implementation. Go on to the next slide. This is an example of the MISO. We started discussions of what we were going to do, what the market design was going to be on June 14, 2001. There was nothing before that, and we went live in April 1, 2005. So the whole thing took less than 4 years. They had no existing dispatch across the footprint. They had a control building, but they had no control systems. It was just a shell. There was nothing there. They were starting from scratch. There was no history of economic dispatch. And moreover, they had to spend years fighting over the conversion of existing transmission rights to FTRs. And because PJM configuration involved the MISO, they also had to implement joint congestion management at go live. But they did all this and went live in 4 years. Europe should be in a lot better situation than MISO was in 2001. Next slide. Now, shifting to comments, a few comments on market coordination. There's no need, as several people said, there's no need for all Europe to switch to LMP in a big bang. It can be switched region by region, which is just what happened in the US. A lot of the mechanisms for coordination across regions have been worked out, like the joint congestion management I talked about between PJM and MISO. That was implemented 20 years ago. We got a track record of how to do that. So that's not something that has to be reinvented. The independent evolution of market designs across ISOs has been a reality in North America, and I think it's a good thing because there's innovation based on what the resource mix is in that region and the other region, and then you can cross-fertilize it as the resource mix changes across the footprint, and it speeds the evolution of innovation. But next and final slide. Another aspect of coordination is that LMP markets accurately value imports and they accurately value exports. They are the value of the export is the cost of export generating that power at that location for export, and imports is the value and reduced generation cost. That means you can rely on decentralized scheduling of imports and exports by market participants because they face the right price signal and they do the right things. On the other hand, Ontario, which went to LMP, I know from my work with the market monitor there over the years, is that they had lots of problems because those prices weren't right. They didn't reflect the value of imports. They didn't reflect the value of exports. So on the one hand, they were making massive constrained off payments, which infuriated the regulator for imports that weren't worth anything, and they were exporting power at less than its costs. So LMP actually facilitates liquidity because the prices are right. And that's, I'll talk more about any of these things in the breakout session, but that's my overview comments. Thank you for the opportunity.
Scott, thank you a million times for this presentation. And I hope everybody forgives me if I do a little CAISO business, but just as chair of the California ISO Market Surveillance Committee, I wanted to just take a second to personally acknowledge how crucial, Scott, your leadership, deep understanding, and dedicated effort has been to the work of the MSC that we jointly serve. You've been the professor, not us, and the public, other committee members, and IESO staff have been the students. So thank you.